Absolutely no one buys a digital Hasselblad to make videos, and why would they? This CFV250C has video features that are limited to 30 FPS in 1080p. You can't flip the screen to film yourself while recording. There's no autofocus while filming, no HDMI out, no internal mic, no cold shoe mount, or any simple way to attach one. And my version crashes more often than a Commodore 64. But just when you think I've talked you out of it, here's a tasty concept you might not be able to resist. You can attach this back to a vintage Hasselblad 500. And now we've got the novelty of being able to record video using one of the most famous medium format film cameras ever made. Even though video features were an afterthought for this sort of camera, it's really cool that I can make a 1080p video through a camera body that went to the moon. I made a couple of videos using this particular camera, one to test if the concept would work at all, and another to make an interview reel with Susan, a local boutique decor shop owner who now has what I think is the only full interview filmed entirely with a vintage Hasselblad. The link to the full interview will be in the description below. My lens collection has a 50mm, an 80mm, a 120mm macro, a 250mm lens, and a 500. And I tried them all out during filming. They're all the early versions of the lens with the scalloped focus rings. I also wanted to try and use extension tubes for a few macro shots. The digital back is really a crop-censored medium format sensor, much smaller than the size of the film the camera was originally designed for. So an 80mm lens, which would normally be a normal lens, is cropped probably closer to the 120 or 150mm that you'd expect to get on a traditional medium format frame. It's still twice the size of a 35mm sensor though. Quite unusual to make a video through one of these. Pressing record is way more complicated than you'd imagine because the camera body was never designed with video in mind. The first thing to do is make sure the camera is wound. Then you need to set the lens to bulb mode. To prevent the shutter from closing again, you have to use the T setting, which I think means time setting, and it's near the shutter button. Or on other models, newer models like this 500CXi that don't have a T setting, you have to attach a cable release with a lock knob on it. Now you can press the shutter and it stays open to let light through to the sensor. Remember, if the shutter's ever released, you have to wind the camera and do that entire sequence over again. And we're not there yet. Now it's all open to the sensor, you can start the live view on the back and change the aperture to the desired opening on the lens. The rest of the exposure is set on the screen where you can change the ISO and the shutter speed. There's only two options for videos in the setting. You can either shoot 1080p, 30 frames a second, or 2.7K in 30 frames a second. And that's if you want a bit more cropping flexibility. Focusing, of course, is manual, but it does have focus peaking to help you out. And the big screen helps out too. I like to double tap and focus on the zoomed in image before finally pressing record. The focus ring on these lenses can be quite tight, so we've got to be really careful when doing a focus pull to not move the camera, even if it's on a tripod. The audio was recorded with a lapel mic and a backup mic attached to the camera's audio in. The CFV250C back doesn't have any internal microphone or any way to mount cold shoe accessories. But the vintage 500 cameras have this cold shoe adapter on the left-hand side. Now you can attach an external mic so I can sync the video with the lapel mic in post-production. In theory. Here's the sound from the lapel mic.
And so it's my favorite thing when they walk in and they're like, oh, I love this.
And here's the sound from the external mic attached to the back.
And so it's my favorite thing when they walk in and they're like, oh, I love this.
It's a $6,000 piece of kit. Knowing that the internal audio sounds worse than a VHS tape stored in salt water, I used a Zoom H1 as a room mic, serving as the backup for the lav mic. It's on the table in front of Susan. The widest lens I have is this 50mm, so I used that for the establishing shot of Susan placing items on her shelves, and for the main angle for the interviews. It's at times like this where I wish I had something much wider, but in the V system, that means getting a dedicated super wide body, something that I've not got in the collection. Now I've only got one digital back, which means I couldn't use two cameras at the same time for the interview. Instead, I did a full second take after the first using the 80mm lens shot wide open at f2.8, and man, it looks good. It's so much easier to get background separation with this lens. Adding a second angle helped with cutting the shots together in the edit. Now this 120mm lens is a planar, meaning it's suited to making close focus images of flat planes, like copying documents or negatives. With an extension tube or two, we can do a bit of macro work with it, though we lose a few stops of light in the process. I use a stack of a 21 and a 10mm macro tube for these close-up shots. For 1080p through a lens that's older than the internet, the image quality holds up. This 500mm lens is one of the cheapest lenses you can find for the 500 system, probably because it's big, heavy, and slow. It's f8 at its widest, and that can be pretty limiting if you were using 100 or 400 speed film. But we've got access to digital ISOs of 800, 1600, 3200 here, and they're all usable. I couldn't find a natural way to use a 500mm lens for the interview, but I used it for this outdoor scene, B-roll where there's plenty of available light. The sensor crop factor works in your favor at the telephoto end. Lots of lovely compression. The final edit of the interview is about 2 minutes long. I'm happy with the result, and I'm happy putting my name on it. I was hoping the footage would look a bit more medium format, but I think the cropped sensor mutes the effect, along with the lower resolution of the images compared to still photography. Still, the video looks good for using equipment that was designed in the 1950s. You're obviously not going to buy this camera for its video specs, and I absolutely do not recommend it for video after this deep dive. Though I love the idea of video through vintage lenses because they were designed before sterile perfection was demanded of them. And lots of people get a flavour for this by adapting vintage lenses to their 35mm digital cameras. This Helios adapted to a digital Canon is a great example. And that's what I've used to film my talking head shots in this video. Let me know about your experiences with digital video through vintage film equipment. And if you want to know more about this Hasselblad back, check out my review of its still image features, because that's what it was made for.